We live in a toxic political climate where there's a certain type of person who never actually goes to cities but just talks bad about them all the time. Well, I went to visit a city that's taken maybe a bigger reputational hit than any other. Detroit, Michigan, which, if you've seen it in the news at any point in the past few decades, it was probably a story about bankruptcy or depopulation or glorious buildings falling into ruin. But the story in 2024 is much different and much more complicated than I thought, and it's all coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation, viewer-suggested topics always welcome, and when I told my patrons that I wanted to use their contributions to travel to a city and make a video, and I asked what city they wanted to know more about, Detroit was the #1 answer, hands down. And I'm gonna be honest, I've been to and filmed a lot of different cities since I started this channel, but this is the first time I've felt like a bit overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the stories there are to tell. I mean, the suburbs here are fascinating, but I tried to keep it manageable by limiting myself to Detroit proper. But even that turned out to be biting off more than I could chew. You'll see what I mean. Let's start with just downtown, which honestly probably justifies its own video. The first thing that jumps out at you is the street network, which isn't really like anything else in the US except maybe DC. And you do see the grid pop up as part of the city's iconography here and there. I do like a Cartesian grid like you get in most American cities. They're intuitive and navigable, but there's something to be said for a street layout that has no vanishing points. It just makes for a more interesting view when you look down any given street. The thoroughfares that converge on downtown are wide, but they were laid out in the early 1800s, long before the advent of the automobile. And the automobile has long since consumed all of these streets, but some are still wide enough to accommodate, say, a linear park right down the middle, like here on Washington Boulevard. We have to talk about the buildings themselves because a lot of what's here is just spectacular. The Detroit Fox Theater, largest of all the Fox theaters at over 5,000 seats, originally for movies and now a performance venue. The Book Tower, dating from 1916, in decline through most of the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st, but purchased by Dan Gilbert in 2015, and more about him later. And now the Book is a buzzy mix of housing, hotel, retail, and restaurants. The Guardian building from 1928, the exterior is just mind-blowing. The colors and the patterns feel like they're from a different world. And the interior, I don't like to throw around the word psychedelic, just decide for yourself. This is all just to say, when I talk about a city having great bones, downtown Detroit has all of it. And if all your knowledge of this city came from news accounts of like the last 60 years, you might assume downtown Detroit is a burnt out husk. I mean, a lot of cities' downtowns feel like that post-pandemic, but Detroit's second tallest tower is currently under construction, and I will get to the tallest one later in the video. And there's just a lot more going on here on a normal weekday than you'd have ever been led to expect from what you hear in the national news. Not just new construction, but rehabilitation of beautiful old building stock. Also, the alleyways downtown, like Parker's Alley at the back of the Shinola Hotel and the Belt, make for really interesting car-free route options as you walk around downtown. I just didn't see very many empty storefronts, and I can't speak to the economic incentives the city is offering to make that happen, but there was more foot traffic than I've seen in the downtowns of a lot of US cities. Probably a testament to how much employment and residential they've been able to attract back to Detroit's core. The ground zero for what's happening downtown, literally the 0 point on the grid, I believe. Campus Martius, which has been renovated into a pretty first-rate public space. Really beautifully done with the mix of old and new buildings enveloping the park, and very well used on what's just kind of a run-of-the-mill Wednesday afternoon. It's got a bit of a public-private feel to it. There's a restaurant on site, and you can tell there are lots of programmed activities, for better or worse. Probably better because when I got in late Monday, it was just in time for the wrap-up of the Detroit Jazz Festival, which was still going strong late into the night in the heart of downtown on Campus Martius, and I kind of wondered if the odd angles of the downtown streets made for the incredible acoustics they were getting. Just beautiful stuff. Okay, before we get too much farther, let's acknowledge that the current state of downtown Detroit, and the city at large, is heavily influenced by 3 billionaire families. The Ford family, and you'll see their name everywhere. Dan Gilbert, founder of Rocket Mortgage, and basically anything you see in Detroit that has the word rock in it, Gilbert is involved. If you're being uncharitable, you could say Gilbert bought up a lot of downtown Detroit on the cheap, and his company, Rock Ventures, is transforming it into kind of a sanitized, family-friendly lifestyle center. But in my humble opinion, this is relatively benevolent billionaire stuff, and Gilbert was bullish on his hometown at a time when the city's reputation was in pretty dire straits. The third family whose imprint on the city you can't really miss is the Illiches, who became filthy rich by inventing a recipe and production process for a pizza-like food item that can be sold at something like half the price of an actual pizza. Ironic, since the city is currently better known for a completely different pizza-like item, which is much, much more edible. Anyway, conventional wisdom is, if you see underutilized surface parking anywhere in the inner parts of Detroit, that's likely an Illich holding, so the city becomes kind of like a billionaire's Rorschach test. When you look at Detroit, do you see a place where your real estate investment is better left dormant, or do you see a city that's ready to pop right now? Not unrelated, Detroit is the major US city that's gotten farthest down the path of implementing a land value tax, which would increase the tax on and incentivize development of currently vacant land and reduce the tax burden on a lot of developed parcels. So let's talk about Detroit's vacant land situation, because I want to do a little tour of some of the city's inner neighborhoods. Again, there are only so many places I can get to when I only have 3 full days to explore and film, and I will come back and talk about transportation connections, but for now let's hit Midtown, the next area just north of downtown. And this is going to be a theme throughout this video, but the juxtaposition of just incredible old building stock, vacant land where old building stock used to be, and some new development. I just find walking through it as a humbling and even an emotional experience. The term Midtown is a relatively recent rebranding of what I believe was traditionally considered the Cass Corridor. And I will come back to Cass Avenue in a bit, but the area has changed pretty radically in the last 10 to 15 years. The campus of Wayne State University is here, and that adds to some of the vibrancy. The local population skews pretty young, and you can definitely use the word gentrification if you want. There's even a Whole Foods here, and the sign just inside the door echoes a sentiment I actually did hear from a lot of Detroiters when they heard I was making a video about their city. But gentrification is a pretty loaded term, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people who would tell you that this was a better place in the later decades of the 20th century. Next door to the east, Brush Park, just incredible housing stock of varying condition, often right next to a vacant lot where you can only imagine what used to be there. You're going to see all kinds of evidence of the massively affluent city Detroit used to be, and evidence of the city's decline, and evidence of new optimism, sometimes all 3 of these things within the same camera shot. So I'm hoping you're starting to get a feel for why I say this is a city that's almost overwhelming in how many stories it has to tell. For now, let's work our way north. Not all the wild Art Deco buildings are downtown. This is the Fisher Building in the district called New Center, which, when it was developing in the 1920s, was literally envisioned as a new center that would have good connections to both downtown and the outlying factories of the burgeoning auto industry. It's also home to Detroit's current passenger rail station, and I'll talk a bit more about train stations later. Further out, we get into the north end and even more evidence of the depopulation that was happening over most of the last 75 years. You guys do realize Detroit proper had a population of almost 2 million in the 1950s, and it's down in the 600,000s now. It's beyond the scope of this video to talk about how things like freeway building, redlining, white flight, and disinvestment ravaged a lot of American cities in general, and Detroit in particular. But you can't help feeling like you're coming face to face with that as you walk around an area like the North End. I mean, there's something slightly cool about urban agriculture, but it's really an indication that something went horribly wrong in the not too distant past. Okay, I need to take a little detour here and talk about street design. It's clear that a lot of Detroit's north-south arterials were designed for a time when the city had ambitions of being a metropolis of 15 to 20 million. In fact, you can imagine a time when that was the projection, given how bonkers the auto industry here was in the early and mid-20th century. But the city's trajectory really went the opposite way, so now you have 4-lane, one-way arterials that are so barren of traffic that a squirrel can just take its sweet time crossing all 4 lanes. I call things like this opportunity sites. Further north, we're in the Boston Edison neighborhood, and this is where I really got the sense that this is a city that was, at one time, by some accounts, the wealthiest city on the planet. We're about 4 miles from downtown, and you've got quiet boulevards that are lined with a procession of all kinds of English and Mediterranean revival styles. A lot of these housed auto industry execs at one point. Maybe they still do, but also Motown executives and recording artists, pro athletes. This is just where you wanted to live, and most of the homes do seem pretty well maintained, so maybe it still is. Starting again downtown, if you go east along the Detroit River, you'll get a series of small neighborhoods called the Villages. Remember that Detroit is the birthplace of the automobile, but a lot of the city proper was laid out well before Henry Ford was even born. The area is historic, yes, and I regret to inform you that NIMBYism even exists in Detroit. Just imagine being against adding population to a city that's down like 70% from its peak in the 1950s. Just incredible stuff. You might have noticed I've got some POV biking footage here, and you might have even noted the odd bike share station as we've been touring various neighborhoods. Detroit does have a Bixby-style bike share system, MoGo, and the question I had to ask myself as I started noticing these was, am I really going to bike in Detroit, the capital of Motordom? And my knee-jerk answer was absolutely not, but knee-jerk answers are unworthy of this channel. The truth is, just about every one of the neighborhoods I've shown you so far is inside the MoGo service area. And once I convinced myself to buy a pass, which is $15 for 3 days and gets you unlimited 60-minute rides, I mean, it's a crazy deal if you're visiting. I basically found myself biking everywhere because not only is Detroit pancake flat, but the city has done pretty impressive work in expanding bike infrastructure in the last 10 years or so. You can ride over the bridge into Belle Isle Park, which I'm told has a beach. And if you bike all the way to Sunset Point, you get pretty solid views of Detroit and Windsor on the other side of the Canadian border. The Detroit Riverwalk is bikeable, and basically all of it is within the MoGo service area. Although it can get a bit congested, but it passes by lots of interesting locations. It is beautiful, in my opinion. And I'm just gonna sit back and roll a bit of this without commentary. If you want to get north into the city from the riverfront, there are a few options, but the low-stress champion has to be the DeQuindre Cut, which is a below-grade rail-to-trail project along the Grand Trunk Western Railroad, kind of reminiscent of the Midtown Greenway if you watch my Minneapolis videos. Pretty well used, and this was just a Tuesday afternoon. You can take the DeQuindre Cut to the Eastern Market, east of Midtown, and it isn't really hopping unless it's a Saturday, but they do a smaller Tuesday market, and architecturally, the Eastern Market is just super interesting. The main way I got north, though, because I did end up in Midtown and New Center more than I was expecting, was the Cass Avenue protected bike lane. You can pick it up downtown, pretty close to the riverfront. You can roll on by the Rosa Parks Transit Center and the Detroit People Mover, both of which I will come back and discuss shortly. Cass Avenue goes right through the heart of Midtown and New Center, and even though it's a block off of Woodward, which is the obvious central spine of the city, Cass Avenue actually feels like a more interesting street in a lot of ways, and riding it gives you a very different viewpoint on the city than what you'd get traveling any other way. I'm often not a fan of bike facilities that are a block off the main drag, but Cass Avenue is, in a lot of ways, the street you want to be on in the first place. I'm not going to sugarcoat this though. Detroit is a big city, and a lot of the interesting things that you might want to go see are in neighborhoods that aren't quite as bikeable as the neighborhoods I've been showing you, or sometimes they're in the suburbs. Like if you want to go to Hamtramck, which is an incorporated city that exists within the boundaries of Detroit, the nearest bike share station is over a mile away, and the bike connections seemed a little lacking anyway. Used to be a Polish enclave, but now you can get Yemeni food, which is probably an upgrade. Or I guess you could just get a Coney dog on your walk back to Detroit. You know, I kept reading this sign as "Help me Walter Sobchak," but I probably watched too many Coen Brothers movies. Okay, unfortunately, we have to talk about transit now, and to call it a mixed bag is probably being charitable. Let's talk rail transit first, which is very limited. The Q line opened in 2017 and it runs along Woodward Avenue, connecting the riverfront, Campus Martius, Grand Circus, where the theaters and sports venues are, Midtown, and New Center. On the plus side, the Q line is free. On the other hand, it's a modern streetcar that just runs in mixed traffic on yet another street that has way more general purpose capacity than it needs. I just submit to you that if your city's population is down like 70% from its historical peak, it might not kill you to repurpose a couple lanes on your 7-lane arterial for dedicated transit. And we absolutely have to talk about the Detroit People Mover, an elevated train that circulates through downtown Detroit and opened for service in 1987. I'm conflicted on this one because, on the one hand, the service area it covers is an area I would just basically walk, but maybe that's me being ableist. Also, it is a literal circulator. It only runs one direction, counterclockwise, so if for some unimaginable reason you wanted to take an elevated train from Greektown to Bricktown instead of, I don't know, walking 2 blocks, you have to go all the way around the Horn. On the plus side, well, trains are cool. Also, the frequency was much better than I was expecting. Also fareless, and the obvious comparison here is the Miami Metro Mover, but the Detroit system has higher capacity trains. It really is more like a mini L that you just wish connected to more places and ran both directions. By the way, I did literally get to Detroit the evening of the last People Mover service until like November, since they were shutting down service for a couple months of maintenance. Maybe they're adding a track that runs clockwise? One can dream. Okay, and trains are cool, but the vast majority of transit ridership in Southeast Michigan is by bus. And I did take the bus from Rosa Parks Transit Center downtown out to Livernois and 7 Mile Road, which is like an hour bus ride. But I wanted to get out to the rogue MOGO stations that are clustered around Livernois, and to the interesting new bike infrastructure they have along that street, aka the Avenue of Fashion. But I absolutely couldn't figure out an efficient bike route to get out there. Other than it being a long bus ride, it was fine. People I talked to said you haven't had an authentic Detroit transit experience until you've waited for a bus that has 60-minute headways, and then it just goes out and leaves you stranded because of driver shortages. Look, I only have 3 days when I visit a city, so I don't have time for all that, but what I do have time for is the National Transit Database. Here's the transit operations spending per capita for every urbanized area over 2 million people in the United States, and this is Detroit. And that's as good a segue as I can think of to talk about the reason I actually came to Detroit, which is the fine folks at Transportation Riders United reached out practically a year ago and made a really compelling case for why I should come out and talk about their city. And yes, I did do an event. I met lots of great folks, and I could really feel how much Detroiters care about their city and finding ways to make it more navigable for people who either can't afford to drive or simply don't want to. TRU does great advocacy work, so if you care about having a Detroit where transit service goes where you go, when you need it, and does it efficiently, consider supporting by donating or becoming a member. I did this whole trip on my own dime, or I guess more accurately with funding and valuable input from my patrons. So if you enjoy this kind of content where I visit a city and give you my perspective, and eat square pizza. There are lots of ways to support that, but honestly, we'll both feel better if you just support your local advocacy organizations. Okay, a little CityNerd backstory. When I was little, I used to clip pictures of cities and like skyscrapers out of magazines because that's how old I am. And I remember seeing the Renaissance Center for the first time and thinking how cool and modern and futuristic it was, and how cool Detroit must be for having such an interesting building. Well, Detroit is cool, but actually walking into the Ren-Cen, as they call it, feels a bit like sneaking around on the Death Star. It is an interesting building. It's a bit like a self-contained city with its own Marriott in the core tower. It's got its own people mover station, although you kind of have to squint to see it on the signage. But most importantly, it's currently the headquarters for General Motors, meaning it has a GM company store where you can buy swag that declares your allegiance to Motordom, and a massive display of past and future GM products in a rotating display in the atrium. Also, there are interpretive displays where you can learn how General Motors is definitely 100% gonna solve crashes, emissions, and congestion, including their Factory Zero initiative, which is gonna solve all these seemingly intractable problems by manufacturing more street-legal military vehicles, I guess. It's hard to say how much progress the auto industry has made on any of this stuff in the last 100-odd years. At the Detroit Public Library main branch in Midtown, there's a beautiful mural up on the 3rd floor called Man's Mobility, which I think is intended to glorify the city's role in the birth of the motor age. But this part of the triptych that shows a newfangled internal combustion engine vehicle just absolutely terrorizing every horse, dog, and human in sight kind of feels like it's sending a more subversive message. Look, I don't want to be overly cynical about this because I know there are people working in the auto industry that really want to evolve it in a positive direction. I actually met a couple of them when I was in Detroit, and they wanted me to go check out the Michigan Mobility Corridor, which I think is something that doesn't exist yet. And I'm not a fan of trying to film things that don't exist. So instead I went to Michigan Avenue and the Corktown neighborhood, which actually does exist and has, in fact, existed for longer than any other neighborhood in Detroit. Again, pretty easy to bike to from downtown. It's well inside the MoGo service area, and the newest protected bike lanes on Michigan are pretty good, other than bricks not being my favorite surface for biking on, but I get it. A couple points of interest. The corner ballpark on the footprint of old Tiger Stadium at Michigan and Trumbull, which was a similar vintage to Wrigley and Fenway and was also nestled into a great inner neighborhood. But the Tigers now play at Comerica downtown, which is a fine location, except the stadium is really surrounded by surface parking and doesn't dovetail with the urban fabric the way Tiger Stadium did. What's done is done though, and after some false starts, the area around the old ballpark is filling in, and there's still amateur ball happening on the footprint of the old diamond. Major point of interest number 2, Michigan Central Station, a few blocks further west. Michigan Central had been shuttered for decades, but was renovated and reopened this year as offices and mixed use, with the renovation led by the Ford Motor Company. You really do get a feel for the city's identity in Corktown, both what Detroit was historically before the advent of the automobile, and what Detroit is today. Lots of people suggested that when I visit just about anywhere in Detroit in 2024, I go into Google Street View and use the time slider to get a sense of where things were 10 or 15 years ago. And you know, I absolutely cannot resist a good Street View time slider session. So if someone tries to tell you that Detroit is in irreversible decline, or that if you live in a city like Detroit, you should just move somewhere else, or that American cities are hopeless and just not worth fighting for, I think a Detroit visit might just give you a different perspective. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and special thanks to my patrons whose direct support makes it possible for me to go to cities that I think have compelling stories that we can all learn from. Keep the great topic and travel suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.